Did you know that in some parts of history, a man choosing to remain single could face special taxes simply for not being married? Or that his very character, his maturity, and even his loyalty to society could be called into question, all because he did not have a wife? Imagine a world where being a bachelor meant you were automatically under a cloud of suspicion, your every move scrutinized. What if simply being unmarried made people see you not as a free spirit, but as a potential danger or a social burden? The past held some truly surprising and harsh views for men who walked the path of singlehood. Let's uncover some of the toughest social hurdles bachelors once faced. Number 6. The perpetual shadow of suspicion, accused of hidden vices. Throughout many periods of history, the unmarried man often found himself living under a cloud of suspicion. This was not always about one specific accusation, but rather a general sense that a man who chose to live outside the conventional structure of marriage and family might be hiding something, or perhaps indulging in behaviors considered unacceptable by the wider community. His independence, which might be seen as a virtue today, could be twisted into a sign of secrecy and a potential for moral laxity. In societies where marriage was the expected norm and the cornerstone of social order, a bachelor, particularly one of advanced years, could become an object of gossip and speculation. Why? Had he not married? Was there some hidden flaw, some secret life, or some preference that society deemed deviant? This was particularly potent in smaller, close-knit communities, where everyone's business was, to some extent, public knowledge, or at least public conjecture. The unknown aspects of a bachelor's private life could be filled in by the imaginations of others, and these imaginings were not always kind. One of the most severe forms this suspicion could take involve accusations related to a man's sexuality. In many historical contexts, particularly in Western societies influenced by strict religious doctrines, any sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage was condemned. For a bachelor, especially one who did not show overt interest in courting women or who kept mostly male company, whispers about homosexuality could arise. Given that homosexual acts were criminalized in many places and times, punishable by imprisonment, public shaming, or even death, such suspicions were incredibly dangerous. The case of Oscar Wilde in late Victorian England is a well-known example of how societal suspicion, followed by accusation and trial for gross indecency, could lead to utter ruin, imprisonment, and social ostracism. While Wilde was a prominent figure, countless other less famous men faced similar, if unrecorded, suspicions that blighted their lives. They had to live with extreme caution, carefully managing their relationships and public personals to avoid drawing negative attention. The suspicion was not limited to sexuality. A bachelor might also be suspected of other vices. Was he a secret gambler, squandering his resources instead of building a family? Was he a covert drinker, indulging to excess, away from the steadying influence of a wife? Was he simply too selfish, too focused on his own pleasures to take on the responsibilities of a household? These kinds of suspicions could affect his reputation, his ability to secure respectable employment, and his standing in the community. If a man was not seen to be investing his time and energy into the recognized social unit of a family, then what, some wondered, was he investing them in? Consider the atmosphere in Puritan New England. Here, society was intensely focused on moral rectitude and communal responsibility. Unmarried individuals, both men and women, were often viewed with unease. They did not quite fit into the tightly ordered social fabric. Bachelors might be required to live with established families, partly for economic reasons, but also so they could be supervised, their behavior monitored by the household head. The idea was that they needed the moral guidance and structure that a family environment and eventually their own marriage would provide. A man living entirely alone might be seen as too independent, too removed from communal oversight, and therefore more susceptible to temptation or ungodly behavior. In 17th century England, during the interregnum and even after the Restoration, there were moral campaigns aimed at suppressing vice. Bachelors, particularly those who frequented taverns or were seen as idle, could become targets of these campaigns. They were sometimes stereotyped as leading dissolute lives. Literature of various periods also played a role in shaping these perceptions. While some bachelor characters were portrayed as charming rogues, others were depicted as secretive, melancholic, or even sinister, figures reinforcing the idea that something was not quite right with a man who remained unwed. The very nature of a bachelor's living arrangements could contribute to this. A man living in lodgings or moving frequently might seem rootless and unaccountable. He lacked the fixed social anchor of a wife and children, a home that was recognized as a family seat. This could make him seem like an outsider, someone whose loyalties were uncertain. In times of social unrest or political tension, such outsiders could easily become scapegoats or objects of fear. The difficulty for bachelors was that these suspicions were often vague and hard to refute. How does one prove they are not secretly engaging in some unnamed vice? The burden of proof was often implicitly on the bachelor to demonstrate his virtue, usually by conforming as much as possible to other social expectations, or ultimately by marrying. Living a life that was private or different from the norm was a risky proposition. Constant awareness of being watched, judged, and potentially misconstrued could be a heavy psychological burden, forcing many bachelors to be guarded and circumspect in their social interactions. This shadow of suspicion meant that their single status was not just a personal choice but a social marker that could invite negative scrutiny and fundamentally shape how they were perceived and treated by the world around them. Number 5. The unsettled soul seen as immature and irresponsible. Another significant social stigma faced by bachelors in the past was the perception that they were fundamentally immature or irresponsible. Marriage was widely regarded not just as a personal relationship, but as a key marker of adulthood and a primary institution for fostering responsibility. A man who avoided or indefinitely postponed marriage could, therefore, be seen as shirking his adult duties, remaining in a prolonged state of adolescence, and lacking the seriousness and stability expected of a mature member of society. This view was rooted in the understanding of societal roles. A married man was typically expected to be a provider for his wife and children, a manager of household affairs, and a contributor to the community through his established family unit. These roles demanded foresight, diligence, and a commitment to others. By contrast, a bachelor, free from these direct familial obligations, might be perceived as living a life that was more self-centered, less grounded, and lacking in serious purpose. His energies, not being channeled into family responsibilities, were sometimes assumed to be spent on frivolous pursuits, personal amusement, or simply an aimless existence. In many cultures, the transition to manhood was closely linked with marriage. For example, in various European societies from the medieval period through to the 19th and even early 20th centuries, a young man was often not considered fully settled or established until he had taken a wife and set up his own household. Before this, he might be seen as still under the wing of his parents or, if living independently, as somewhat adrift. This perception could have tangible consequences for his career and social standing. Employers might prefer married men for positions of responsibility, believing them to be more stable, more motivated by the need to support a family, and less likely to behave erratically. A married man had, in a sense, given hostages to fortune, and was therefore seen as more reliable. Think about the language used to describe bachelors. Terms like eternal boy or confirmed bachelor sometimes carried an undertone of gentle mockery, but also a hint of a man who had failed to complete a crucial stage of personal development. He might be seen as unwilling to take on the sacrifices and commitments that marriage entailed, preferring an easier, less demanding life. This could be interpreted as a lack of character or a weakness of will. In societies that placed a high value on duty and self-sacrifice for the greater good of the family and community, such perceived selfishness was a serious charge. Consider the world of business and public life in, for instance, 19th century America or Britain. A man's family life was often seen as a reflection of his character. A well-ordered home with a wife and children was viewed as evidence of his ability to manage, to lead, and to maintain stability. Bachelors, lacking this visible evidence of domestic responsibility, might find it harder to gain the trust and respect needed to advance in certain professions, or to be taken seriously in civic matters. They were, in a sense, untested in one of the fundamental proving grounds of manhood. Literature and popular culture frequently reinforced these stereotypes. The bachelor character was often portrayed as a charming but ultimately superficial rake, a Peter Pan figure who refused to grow up, or a slightly pathetic individual incapable of forming lasting attachments. While sometimes these portrayals were comedic, they also subtly underscored the societal expectation that a man should eventually settle down. The happy ending in many stories involved the rogue bachelor finally seeing the error of his ways and embracing the responsibilities of marriage. Furthermore, in communities where interfamily alliances and the continuation of lineage were paramount, a bachelor who chose not to marry could be seen as irresponsible towards his own family name and heritage. He was not playing his part in ensuring the family's future. This was particularly true for men from landed or prominent families, where marriage was often a strategic as well as a personal matter. Pressure to marry and thereby demonstrate maturity could be immense. Young men were often counseled by their elders that marriage would make a man of them. It was presented as a necessary step for acquiring gravity, purpose, and the respect of one's peers. Those who resisted this path might face not just gentle teasing, but also serious questions about their fitness for adult life. Their motives might be questioned. Were they too flighty, too self-absorbed, or perhaps even too afraid of the responsibilities that came with being a husband and father? This perception of immaturity could also extend to how their opinions were valued. In community discussions or family councils, the voice of a married man, a head of household, often carried more weight than that of a bachelor. Bachelor was seen as lacking the practical experience and wisdom that came from managing a family and navigating the complexities of married life. His perspective, it was sometimes implied, was necessarily narrower and less informed by the serious realities of life. Thus, the label of unsettled or immature was not just a social descriptive, it could actively limit a bachelor's influence and his ability to be seen as a fully adult, responsible member of his society. Number 4, the lonely burden taxed and treated as socially useless. One of the most direct and tangible stigmas faced by bachelors in the past was the perception that they were in some way socially useless or even an economic burden, a view that sometimes translated into actual financial penalties like bachelor taxes. The reasoning behind this was often tied to the idea that the fundamental unit of society was the family, and those who did not form families were not fully contributing to the state's strength, prosperity, or future. The concept of bachelor taxes has a long history. As far back as ancient Rome, laws were enacted to encourage marriage and procreation, and these sometimes included disincentives for remaining single. The Lex Papia Papia, introduced under Emperor Augustus in 9 AD, is a prime example. This law aimed to bolster the declining birth rates among the Roman upper classes and included provisions that penalized unmarried and childless individuals, for instance, by restricting their ability to inherit property or receive legacies. While the primary aim was to encourage childbirth within marriage, Bachelors were particularly targeted as they were seen as failing in their civic duty to produce future Roman citizens. This idea of bachelors as being less valuable or even a net negative to the state resurfaced at various times and in various places. Throughout Europe, from the medieval period into the modern era, governments occasionally considered or implemented taxes specifically targeting unmarried men. Justifications varied. Sometimes it was explicitly about encouraging population growth, especially after wars or plagues. Other times it was framed more as a matter of fairness. Married men bore the financial burden of raising children, who would become the next generation of workers, soldiers, and taxpayers. Bachelors, by contrast, enjoyed their income without this direct responsibility, and so a special tax could be seen as a way to make them contribute their fair share to the societal enterprise from which they benefited. For example, in England, a tax on bachelors was levied in 1695 under King William IV, partly to fund wars. The tax was graduated based on social status, but all unmarried men over the age of 25 were liable. Similar taxes or proposals for them appeared in various German states, in France, and even in some of the American colonies and later states. In the early 20th century, some countries, including Italy, under Mussolini, used bachelor taxes as part of pro-natalist policies designed to increase the population for nationalistic reasons. Beyond direct taxation, the perception of bachelors as socially less useful could manifest in other ways. They might be overlooked for certain civic duties or honors, as these were often bestowed upon established heads of families. In an economic sense, a man who did not marry and have children was not contributing to the future labor force or the expansion of the domestic market. In the same way a family man was, his consumption patterns were different, and his economic activities might be seen as more self-serving. Term burden could also take on a more social or even moral dimension. In societies that prized community, cohesion, and mutual support, often structured around family networks, a bachelor could be seen as an isolated unit, less integrated into this web of reciprocal obligations. Who would care for him in his old age if he had no wife or children? Community or the state might eventually have to. Thus, his choice to remain single could be viewed by some as potentially creating a future burden on public or charitable resources. This idea of being useless or a burden was deeply dismissive of any contributions a bachelor might make to society outside of forming a family. His work, his friendships, his intellectual or artistic pursuits, or his contributions to his extended family or community in other ways could be overshadowed by his failure to meet the primary expectation of marriage and procreation. It was a narrow definition of social utility, but one that held considerable sway. The psychological impact of being labeled in this way could be significant. To be consistently told directly or indirectly that your way of life makes you less valuable or even a drain on society is a heavy weight to bear. It could lead to feelings of alienation, resentment, or a sense of not truly belonging. Some bachelors might internalize these messages, leading to a diminished sense of self-worth. Others might react with defiance, but even this could further isolate them. Moreover, the label of burden could be self-fulfilling. If society consistently treated bachelors as less important or less trustworthy, it could limit their opportunities for advancement and integration, making it harder for them to be seen as valuable contributors. They might be the last to be considered for a promotion, the first to be suspected in times of trouble, or simply the ones left out of important social and economic networks that revolved around family ties. The very existence of bachelor taxes, even when not universally applied or long-lasting, served as a powerful symbolic statement from the authorities about the preferred social order and the perceived deficiencies of those who did not conform to it. It codified the idea that bachelors owed something more to society, simply because they were bachelors, reinforcing the stigma that they were somehow not pulling their weight, destined to be a lonely and perhaps costly anomaly. Number 3. The incomplete man. His very masculinity under question. In many historical societies, the concepts of manhood and masculinity were inextricably linked with the roles of husband and father. A man's journey to achieving full masculine status was often seen as incomplete until he had married, established a household, and ideally sired children, particularly sons, to carry on the family name. Consequently, a bachelor, especially one who remained unmarried into what was considered middle age or beyond, could find his very masculinity subtly or overtly questioned. He was perceived by some as not having fulfilled a fundamental aspect of his male identity and purpose. This wasn't necessarily about physical attributes, but about social and functional ones. Masculinity was often defined by responsibility, protectiveness, and generativity, the ability to provide for and lead a family, to protect its members, and to contribute to the continuation of society through procreation. Bachelor, by virtue of his single status, was not performing these key masculine roles in the most recognized and valorized way. He was not a patriarch in his own right, however small his domain. Consider the agricultural societies that dominated much of human history. Here, a family was an economic unit, and a man's ability to manage a farm, provide for his dependents, and raise sons to help with labor and inherit the land, were central to his standing as a man. A bachelor lacked this clear demonstration of masculine competence and generativity. He might be a capable worker, but he was not building a lineage or a household in the same way. Religious doctrines often reinforced this connection between masculinity, marriage, and procreation. Many faiths emphasize the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, framing marriage and parenthood as sacred duties. A man who eschewed these duties could be seen as failing not only in a social sense but also in a spiritual one, and by extension failing to embody the divinely ordained masculine role. For instance, in historical Christian contexts, while celibacy was honored for the clergy, for laymen, marriage was the expected path, and fatherhood was a way to reflect God's own creative power. The language used to describe men and their roles often highlighted this. Terms like head of household or paterfamilias conferred a certain gravitas and authority that a bachelor by definition could not claim. His identity was defined by what he lacked: a wife, children, a family to lead. This could lead to a perception that he was somehow less substantial, less anchored in the serious business of life. Think also about rites of passage. In many cultures, marriage itself was a key rite of passage into full adulthood and recognized manhood. Until a man married, he might in some respects still be considered a youth, regardless of his age. His opinions might carry less weight, and he might not be included in councils of married men where important community decisions were made. This questioning of a bachelor's masculinity could be particularly acute in societies with strong martial traditions. While soldiers were often young and unmarried during their active service, the ideal citizen soldier in many historical contexts, like the Roman Republic or Greek city-states, was also a man with a stake in society, a family and property to defend. Fathering future defenders of the state was also part of this masculine ideal. A long-term bachelor might be seen as not fully invested in the future of the community in this crucial way. Popular culture, folklore, and literature often reflected and reinforced these ideas. Bachelor characters were sometimes portrayed as effeminate, overly fastidious, or lacking in vigor, stereotypes that directly undermined their masculine credentials. Alternatively, if portrayed as hypermasculine in a roguish way, this was often depicted as a phase that needed to be outgrown through the civilizing influence of marriage. The confirmed bachelor, who prided himself on his freedom, might still be viewed with a kind of pity, as if he were missing out on a deeper, more meaningful expression of manhood found in family life. The psychological impact of this could be profound. Men are often socialized to aspire to the prevailing ideals of masculinity within their culture. To be constantly, if subtly, reminded that one is falling short of these ideals simply because of one's marital status could lead to feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, or a sense of being an outsider to the dominant male culture. It could affect a man's confidence and his interactions with both men and women. He might feel a pressure to overcompensate in other areas to prove his manliness, or he might withdraw. Moreover, this questioning of masculinity could intersect with other stigmas. For instance, if a bachelor was suspected of hidden vices, like homosexuality as discussed earlier, this was often framed in terms of a failure of proper masculinity. The incomplete man stigma thus served as a broad framework that could encompass and amplify other negative perceptions, creating a situation where a bachelor's entire identity as a man could feel under scrutiny simply because he had not taken a wife. Number 2. The wandering threat, feared as a danger to women and order. One of the more alarming social stigmas faced by bachelors in the past was the perception that they were a potential threat to social order, and specifically, a danger to women. An unmarried man, particularly one who was unattached to a stable household and community, could be viewed with suspicion as someone whose desires were unchecked by marital responsibilities, and whose presence could be disruptive or predatory. This fear often stemmed from the idea that men's sexual appetites were inherently strong and needed to be channeled and controlled through the institution of marriage. A wife and family were seen as providing a legitimate outlet for these desires and a civilizing influence. A bachelor, lacking this outlet and influence, might be suspected of seeking to satisfy his urges illicitly. This made him a figure of anxiety, especially in communities that placed a high premium on female chastity and the sanctity of marriage. In many historical societies, women, particularly unmarried women and young wives, were considered vulnerable and in need of protection from dishonor, from unwanted advances, and from anything that might compromise their reputation or their family's honor. Bachelors, especially those who were perceived as footloose or without strong local ties, could be seen as the very figures from whom women needed protection. Their freedom of movement and lack of direct accountability to a wife or in-laws made them seem less predictable and potentially more dangerous. This fear could manifest in various ways. Unmarried men might find their interactions with women, especially those not related to them, heavily scrutinized. A bachelor seen spending too much time near a married woman or paying undue attention to a young unmarried woman could quickly become the subject of gossip, warnings, or even direct intervention from the woman's male relatives or community leaders. The honor of families was at stake, and men were expected to guard their female kin from any hint of scandal. Consider the social customs of chaperonage that were prevalent in many Western societies, particularly from the Renaissance through the Victorian era. While chaperones were there to guide and protect young women in general, the perceived threat often came from men, and unattached bachelors could be high on the list of those whose intentions were doubted. Their motives were suspect until proven otherwise, often by a formal declaration of honorable intentions, such as a proposal of marriage. In smaller, rural communities, a bachelor who was a newcomer or who lived on the outskirts physically or socially might be particularly vulnerable to being cast as a threat. If any local woman was perceived to have been compromised, or if there were rumors of inappropriate behavior, the bachelor could easily become a prime suspect, whether or not there was any truth to the accusation. He was an outsider, and therefore, an easy target for blame. This could lead to social ostracism, demands that he leave the community, or even vigilante action in extreme cases. The stereotype of the rake or the seducer in literature and popular lore, while sometimes romanticized, also played into this fear. These characters, almost invariably bachelors, were depicted as preying on innocent women, disrupting marriages, and generally causing social chaos through their unchecked desires. While fictional, these portrayals could color public perception of real-life bachelors, reinforcing the idea that they were not to be trusted around respectable women. Furthermore, the bachelor, as a wandering threat, was not just about sexual predation. It could also be about general disruptiveness. Unmarried men, particularly groups of them, were sometimes associated with rowdiness, brawling, gambling, and other behaviors seen as detrimental to public peace and morality. They lacked the settling influence of a wife and children, and so were thought to be more prone to recklessness. This perception could lead to bachelors being more heavily policed or facing harsher judgment for minor infractions. This stigma could also create a climate of isolation. For bachelors, if they were constantly viewed with suspicion, it could be difficult for them to form natural, easygoing friendships or social connections, particularly with families or married individuals. Invitations to family gatherings might be sparse, and they might find themselves excluded from the more intimate aspects of community life. They were, in a sense, kept at arm's length perpetually on the periphery because of the potential danger they were perceived to represent. The pressure to marry, therefore, was not just about fulfilling personal or societal expectations of adulthood, but also about neutralizing this perceived threat. Marriage transformed a man, in the eyes of society, from a potentially dangerous, unattached entity into a responsible stakeholder in the social order, a guardian of his own family rather than a threat to others. For the bachelor who chose to remain single, however, this label of wandering threat could be a constant source of unease, limiting his freedom and coloring his interactions with the community around him, forcing him to navigate his social world with an extra layer of caution and awareness of how his actions might be misconstrued. Number 1. The cursed outcast, doomed to a life of isolation and despair. Perhaps the deadliest stigma of all for bachelors in the past was the cumulative effect of the other societal judgments, leading to a profound sense of isolation and a life that was often perceived both by the bachelor himself and by others as incomplete, lonely, and ultimately unfulfilled. This wasn't always a formal, codified punishment, but rather a slow erosion of social connection, purpose, and support, culminating in what could feel like a social death, long before physical death. The bachelor could become the cursed outcast, not necessarily through any malicious act of his own, but simply by failing to conform to the fundamental societal expectation of marriage. Imagine living in a world where almost all social life, support networks, and rites of passage revolved around the family unit. Baptisms, weddings, community celebrations, mutual aid in times of sickness or hardship, these were all deeply embedded in family and kinship structures. The bachelor, by definition, stood outside the core of this structure. While he might have relatives, parents, siblings, nieces, and nephews, his connection to the daily thrum of family life was different, often more peripheral. As his peers married and started their own families, his social circle would inevitably shift and shrink. Friends who were once companions in singlehood would now have their primary obligations and social activities centered on their spouses and children. The bachelor could find himself increasingly left out, an observer rather than a participant in the life events that marked the passage of time for others. This isolation could be particularly acute in old age, in eras before widespread state pensions or social security systems. The family was the primary source of care and support for the elderly. A wife would care for an ailing husband, and children were expected to look after their aging parents. The bachelor, lacking a spouse or his own direct descendants, faced a much more uncertain future. Who would care for him if he fell ill or became frail? He might have to rely on the charity of more distant relatives, if they were willing or able, or on meager public assistance, which was often stigmatizing in itself. Prospect of a lonely and destitute old age was a very real fear for many unmarried men. Literary portrayals of the miserable old bachelor, often depicted as eccentric, curmudgeonly, and alone, reinforced this societal image of a bleak end. Beyond the practicalities of care, there was the emotional toll of this deep-seated isolation. Humans are social creatures, and the lack of intimate companionship, the absence of a partner with whom to share life's joys and sorrows, could lead to profound loneliness. While some bachelors undoubtedly cultivated rich inner lives or strong friendships, the societal narrative often emphasized what they were missing. They were pitied sometimes, condescendingly, as figures who had missed out on the deepest human connections. This constant societal messaging could be internalized, leading to feelings of sadness, regret, or despair. The label of outcast might not always have been explicit, but it could be felt in countless subtle ways. It could be the assumption that a bachelor had nothing valuable to contribute to conversations about children or domestic life. Could be the awkwardness of being the only single person at a dinner party dominated by couples. It could be the unspoken judgment in the eyes of those who saw his unmarried state as a personal failing or a sign of some inherent flaw. Each instance, small in itself, could contribute to a growing sense of being different, of not quite belonging. This isolation was not just social, but could also be spiritual or existential. In many cultures, achieving a kind of immortality through one's children and the continuation of the family line was a deeply ingrained human aspiration. The bachelor, by not having children, was seen as a dead end, a break in this chain of generations. This could contribute to a sense of purposelessness, especially in societies where a man's legacy was so closely tied to his descendants. The other stigmas fed into this ultimate state of being an outcast. If he was seen as immature, number 5, irresponsible, or even a threat, number 2, it naturally led to social distancing. If his masculinity was questioned, number 3, it could undermine his confidence in forming relationships. If he was viewed as a social burden, number 4, or under suspicion for hidden vices, number 6, these perceptions would further alienate him from the community. All these threads wove together to create a social fabric from which the bachelor could find himself increasingly excluded. The curse was not supernatural, but social. 'Twas the weight of collective disapproval, the slow attrition of belonging. For some, this might have been a chosen path, a deliberate rejection of societal norms in favor of independence. But even for those who chose it, the price was often a significant degree of loneliness and the constant need to navigate a world that was not designed for them, a world that frequently reminded them of their outsider status. The unspoken tragedy for many bachelors of the past was not just that they were unmarried, but that their society often made it incredibly difficult for them to lead a life that felt fully connected, valued, and complete without that one specific institution. This profound, encompassing isolation, with its implications for both mental well-being and physical support, arguably made it the most deadly of the social stigmas they faced.